Welcome to everyone joining us for this webinar, where we're going to be discussing the forthcoming Directive on Measures for a High Common Level of Cybersecurity across the EU, also known as NIS2. I am John Timmins. I'm a partner at White & Case based in London. My area of practice is data protection, cybersecurity, and regulatory engagement. We've seen a real shift in attitudes to cybersecurity in recent years, both from a legal and practical perspective. And with the introduction of NIS2, we expect that this trend will continue and become a dominant point of conversation within organizations for the months and years to come. Today, I'm joined by one of my fellow partners who is also part of our team advising on NIS2 at White & Case, Clara Hansdorf, who I will pass over to now to introduce herself.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Clara Hansdorf, as John mentioned. I'm a partner based in Paris. My area of practice covers cybersecurity and data protection, and it extends to IP/IT and commercial contracts. And as John mentioned, we can see indeed real concern on cybersecurity, but not only relating to NIS2, but also with respect to additional EU regulations that may be relevant to your activities like DORA or CER. And I let John start with the first slide.
So moving on to what we're going to discuss today. Now, before we talk about the key issues, let's quickly cover how we arrived at NIS2. So NIS2 itself replaces the Directive on the Security of Network and Information Systems, which is now known as NIS1. Now, NIS1 was an important milestone in cybersecurity law across the EU. It was the first EU-wide cybersecurity legislation and aimed at improving the level of cybersecurity across the EU. However, the deficiencies with NIS1 and its limitations were apparent from the outset, and they became more acute with the passage of time. Now, for those who are not aware, NIS1 came into force around the same time as the GDPR, and I think was lost maybe in the haze of all the efforts that had gone into preparing for that piece of legislation. But nevertheless, it was there and it did have some impact. But very specifically, the limited scope of NIS1 and the number of organizations that it covered meant that it did not lead to the broad uplift in the general level of cybersecurity across the EU as had been intended or was hoped for. Now, it had an impact on the organizations that were in scope, of course, but given the digitization of economies and the number of organizations within the modern economy who have exposure to cybersecurity threats and the impact that such threats, if they materialize, could have on societies and economies, meant that it was seen anyway that legislation had to be developed to cover more organizations and impose a more harmonized suite of obligations across the EU. So, on top of the limited scope, on top of the fact that the obligations in this one were very high level and left a lot of flexibility at member state level, this led to fragmentation across the EU. It made it very difficult for organizations who had exposure to multiple jurisdictions to comply, and there were cost implications associated with doing so. So in step NIS2. Now, NIS2 itself is part of a new European digital package relating to cybersecurity. NIS2 comes in alongside other legislation dealing with cybersecurity issues, such as the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which imposes cybersecurity obligations on financial services organizations specifically, and that will take effect from January 2025. It also sits alongside the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a piece of legislation intended to improve the cyber resilience and cybersecurity of products which have a digital element. So think about Internet of Things devices, I suppose. And then thirdly, it sits alongside the Cyber Solidarity Act, which is a piece of legislation intended to improve and strengthen incident response across the EU. So together, the aim of the legislation that's been proposed in this area is to just improve cybersecurity levels across Europe. So NIS2 specifically tackles some and many of the deficiencies that were identified from NIS1, and we'll discuss those in these sessions. You know, it applies to a much broader range of organizations and creates somewhat of a harmonized approach to the minimum cybersecurity measures that need to be implemented. But it should be remembered that NIS2 is an EU directive, which means it has to be implemented in each member state. So while it may help to establish a more harmonized approach to cybersecurity across the EU, divergences are still likely to occur and will have to be accounted for by organizations who are caught. So today, what I would say actually at the outset is honestly that there are far more points to discuss around NIS2 than we could possibly cover in the time that we have. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on the key issues concerning NIS2 that we've encountered in our experience advising on this and discussing it with organizations. So we're going to look at the range of organizations that will be subject to NIS2, or more specifically, the national laws implementing NIS2. We're going to look at what the cybersecurity risk management measures are and what they require of organizations. We will discuss incident reporting obligations, because this represents quite a significant step change and will be challenging for organizations that are coming at this legislation new. We will also discuss what does regulation look like in practice? So what are the supervisory powers of the relevant authorities? What are the enforcement powers that they have should non-compliance be identified? And then we will touch briefly on the status of the national laws implementing NIS2 and where we are on that journey. And then we'll open the floor to some questions and answers, and we'll see where we get to. So with all that said, I will hand over now to Clara, who's going to discuss the scope of NIS2.
Thanks, John. So about the scope of NIS2, it really represents a significant evolution in the approach of cybersecurity within EU, because it really reflects a paradigm shift from targeting specific threats to recognizing that basically no entity is immune from cyber risk. So this requires a comprehensive, proportionate, and systematic regulatory response across the EU. And this mainly to ensure that the cost of implementing security measures remains lower than the actual cost of cyber attacks. And the first measure, as John mentioned, of this directive is to broaden the scope of entities that were covered by NIS1 directive. So NIS2 applies to all of the organizations that were caught by NIS1 and more, including many who have previously had no real exposure to cybersecurity legislation. And by expanding the scope of cybersecurity rules to these new sectors and new entities, NIS2 further enhances the resilience and incident response capabilities of both private and public entities, but also competent authorities and the EU as a whole. So this directive aims to establish rules that are proportionate, we mentioned that, but it's proportionate to the size of the entities and tailored to systematic threats. So it includes defining thresholds and types of entities that would be affected, in particular focusing on the most numerous, which are important entities mentioned on the right of the slide. Because NIS2 splits the types of entities into two categories. As you can see, you have the essential entities and the important entities. And this distinction is quite an evolution from NIS1, because it used to apply to essential service operators and digital service providers. But with the constant progression of digital transformation, the European Commission found that this distinction was no longer really appropriate, and because other entities could be considered as essential or important. So practically speaking, what does it mean? What are those entities? Essential entities qualify as such if it employs at least 250 people and or achieves annual sales in excess of 50 million euros. So essential entities, we'll see later on, but are, for example, those in the energy, transport, banking, as you can see, financial market infrastructures, all these sectors mentioned here from 1 to 10. Why do they qualify as essential? It's because they play really a key role in ensuring the continuity of vital societal and economic functions. And so they have a significantly greater potential to impact the economy and society adversely if their services are disrupted in comparison to the other entities that are only deemed important. So by contrast, the important entity qualify as such if they employs at least 50 people and or has annual sales in excess of 10 million euros. And as mentioned, sectors are rather in the postal sector, waste management, manufacturing, digital services, research, and food sectors. Note that these criteria relating to the number of employees and turnover are not really specifically mentioned in the NIS2 directive, but really come from the EU recommendation in 2003, defining small and medium-sized enterprises. So to help entities assess whether they are subject to NIS2, the directive contains two annexes relating to the scope. Annex 1 outlines the sectors of high criticality, which can either be essential or important, depending on the organization's total annual revenue and size, the criteria we just mentioned. And Annex 2 provides the other critical sectors, but which will only fall into the important entity category. So in fact, you have about 18 sectors covered by NIS2 directive. And although there are certain exceptions, the legislation typically applies to all large and medium-sized organizations in the specified sectors, both public and private. So the only real impact that flows from this new distinction between essential and important entities is the nature of the regulatory supervision and the level of fines that might be applied for non-compliance. Because both categories obviously must comply with the same security measures. However, while essential entities are subject to proactive monitoring, important entities will only be monitored after a non-compliance incident has been reported. And this level of supervision will be defined by member states. So that's why organizations must promptly determine if they fall within the scope and whether they are classified as essential or important entities. And based on the poll, we can see that many of you have already done the job, at least for the assessment. So if the entity is not designated as essential or important, we must know that it may still be subject to NIS2 if it's directly designated by the authority regarding its services. And without any surprise, NIS2 may also pose serious difficulty to small enterprises. First, because while the directive excludes companies with fewer than 50 employees, that leaves a huge number of companies above the threshold, which are far away from having a mature IT security setup in place. And second, the supply chain management requirements in NIS2, which were one of the key measures, will mean that many companies that are not covered by NIS, but deliver to companies that are in scope, will soon experience the need to document their cybersecurity practices in ways they will, surely struggle to comply with. So they may need, to step up fast or risk being dropped out of the supply chain by important customers. So that is very important. On a national French level, because I'm from the Paris office, just to mention that according to the French government, NIS2 will apply to thousands of entities in more of these 18 sectors, and around 600 different types of entity will be affected, including, as we mentioned, public authorities of all sizes and companies ranging from small to listed companies. So, as we mentioned, the way NIS2 is drafted creates a degree of uncertainty because of its precise scope. The issue is particularly acute when considering whether an entity falls within the essential or important classification, because NIS2 does not adequately account for the possibility that a single entity can satisfy the criteria of both as important and essential entity. Also, the definition of an entity must also be clarified because you may have complex structure. For instance, groups which have several subsidiaries or entities present in several member states with sites outside the European Union. Same, you may have the situation where you have information systems that are shared between regulated and non-regulated entities. In addition, NIS2 does not contain any language that mirrors the language that we had in the recital 22 of NIS1, which stated clearly that the relevant requirements of NIS1 only applied to the in-scope services provided by the in-scope entities. So this has resulted in some confusion, obviously, as to how the operative provision of NIS2 will practically apply to entities that come within scope through satisfaction of separate criteria. Finally, it is unclear whether an entity that comes within scope because it provides a particular type of service, for example, an online marketplace, should be subject to NIS2 with respect to all other services it provides. And for instance, again, a service that is not covered by NIS2, such as sign writing. And so to achieve its ambition, you may not really know what to do in terms of measure to implement, but NIS2 mainly reproduces the measures of the ISO 27001 standard. So basically, an entity that is certified to this standard may not have to make great efforts to comply with NIS2, although obviously compliance with this standard would not automatically guarantee compliance with NIS2. And conversely, those organizations with little or no cybersecurity culture will have to invest huge resources. So for those who are familiar with GDPR, and as with GDPR and DPOs, this raises the issue of the shortage of cybersecurity talent, because now that all of these entities are subject to this regulation, it means that we will need a lot of resources to help them. So, as we mentioned earlier, we'll discuss about obviously the scope, but also these different measures that created the NIS2 directive. And it should be noted that this directive represents a significant evolution because it also introduced a proportionality mechanism upon which national authorities, such as the ANSSI in France, can rely to define those requirements that are appropriate. And NIS2 introduces a more comprehensive range of specific obligations for in-scope entities compared to NIS1. And we're taking a look at those mandatory minimum cybersecurity risk management measurements, and also, and John will take the floor for this, about the incident reporting obligations. So if we start with these cybersecurity risk management measures, NIS2 adopts a risk-based approach to compliance and promotes the use, as we mentioned earlier, of the EU and international standards, risk management standards. It's the Chapter 4 of NIS2 that focuses on these measures and information requirements. And more specifically, it is the Article 21 that outlines both categories of entities, essential and important, which must implement suitable measures to handle risks affecting IT security in their operation or service provision. So as you can see on the slide, NIS2 requires in-scope entities to take appropriate and proportionate technical operation and organizational measures to manage the risk posed to the security of network and information system. You need also to take those measures to prevent or minimize the impact of incidents on recipients. You need also to implement the measures to ensure a level of security of network and information system which is appropriate. So we really definitely see this word of appropriate and proportionate, which gives quite room for interpretation, but at least that gives guidance to the entity. And finally, to take account of the degree of the entity's risk exposure, size, and likelihood of occurrence, because obviously, depending on your size, depending on your activity, as we mentioned earlier, the measures would be different. So overall, the main concern is that entities must ensure business continuity and crisis management and control of third-party risks. And by imposing appropriate and proportionate cybersecurity risk management measures, NIS2 encourages both companies, essential and important entities, to invest in really secure infrastructures and robust management practices. And adopting a proactive approach aligned with the EU standards not only shields businesses from regulatory fines, but also enhances their security reputation, and thereby gaining trust from customers or users in an increasingly complex and interconnected digital landscape. So again, as we mentioned, for those familiar with the GDPR, you can see that NIS2 is also similar to the GDPR requirement regarding data security. Moreover, NIS2 includes a list of 10 elements that all companies have to address or implement as part of the measures they take. And these 10 measures are set out in the same Article 21 we mentioned. The required measures include, as you can see, policies and procedures, measures focused on ensuring supply chain security, policies and procedures to assess effectiveness of cybersecurity risk management, the use of multi-factor authentication, the use of cryptography, and also access control. There are others, but obviously you can see that it's important to put in place the measures, but also to make sure that you're going to train people and conduct audit to make sure that all these measures have been implemented. So the inclusion of a specific list of minimum required measures appears to be addressing a criticism of NIS 1, which is that the individual EU member states exercise significant discretion to stipulate security measures, but which resulted in fragmented and disparate compliance requirements across the EU. And this had a particularly detrimental effect on entities with cross-border operations. And in this regard, NIS 2 requires member states to encourage the use of those standards, the European and internationally accepted standards and specification relevant to the security of networks and information system to ensure this harmonization. The idea is really to promote convergent implementation of these proposed security measures. So what does it mean from a practical standpoint? That means that for entities that were previously covered by NIS 1, they must absolutely review and strengthen their existing practices as far as they stay concerned. They need to ensure that the cybersecurity policies and procedures that mentioned here align with the expanded requirements of NIS 2, meaning that they have to update risk management processes, provide ongoing or additional training to staff, and enhance incident detection and response systems. For new entities, these entities newly concerned by NIS 2, we will need to make an initial assessment of their cybersecurity policy, because this is going to be key, and they will then have to develop and implement those information security policies and all the measures that we just mentioned. So in sum, you can see that there are certain number of steps really similar to this GDPR that we had a few years ago, which is to assess your environment, to identify the measures, to implement those measures, train, and raise awareness. You need to really remain vigilant to these potential threat developments and adjust the strategy. And now I'll let John tell you a little bit more about the incident reporting question.
Thank you very much, Clara. One of the areas that will be particularly challenging for organizations is mandatory incident reporting. I stress mandatory incident reporting as there are voluntary information sharing and notification provisions within NIS 2, but we're not going to spend time talking about those today. We're just going to focus on the mandatory requirements. So why this will pose real challenges for organizations is those that are coming at NIS 2 new or who have very limited experience dealing with breach notification or incident notifications in the past will have to give a great deal of thought as to how they implement these procedures in practice to make sure they are hitting the relevant deadlines for issuing notification to regulatory authorities and providing the correct level of information. So NIS 2 includes detailed reporting obligations that are applicable to the in-scope entities. But as a preliminary point, and before we come on to talk about what those reporting obligations are, I think it is worthwhile spending some time looking at what is considered an incident for the purposes of NIS 2, and then what is considered a reportable incident. So the definition of incident under NIS 2 is drafted specifically, but in very broad terms. It captures a lot of things. So constitutes any event compromising the availability, the authenticity, the integrity, or the confidentiality of stored, transmitted, or processed data, or of the services offered by or accessible via network and information systems. So if you just look at that definition alone, it is incredibly broad, and the number of things that will be considered an incident is vast, almost unlimited. It is any event that compromises the availability, authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality. So it is not just limited to cybersecurity incidents. This could be physical, real-world incidents that happen that have an impact on the network and information systems. So organizations have to be aware of the breadth of that definition. Now, for many organizations, they will encounter multiple incidents on any given day, let alone a week or a month. So organizations will need to make sure their systems and their processes are set up such that they can identify incidents that are happening and then triage them to understand which ones trigger the reporting obligations or not. So the obligation to report an incident under NIS2 is triggered when the incident itself has a significant impact on the provision of the service offered by the entity that is caught. Now, NIS2 sets out the significance threshold within the text, but we will expect some, hopefully, guidance on this to be issued by the European Commission and through the national implementing legislation. But let's start with what it says at the directive level. So under NIS2, an incident will be considered significant and therefore reportable if the incident causes or is capable of causing severe operational disruption of the service or financial losses to the affected entity, or the incident affects or is capable of affecting other natural or legal persons by causing considerable material or non-material losses. If you look at both of those definitions together, so incident and then significant incident, it's pretty clear that a lot of things are going to fall within scope. A significant incident encompasses both potential and actual causes and effects. So we're not just looking at when something goes wrong. So you're not just looking at, has there been severe operational disruption? You're also looking at, is it possible that severe operational disruption could result from the incident? And if it is, then it's reportable. So organizations need to make sure they're capable of assessing the significance of an incident under NIS2. So in practice, what this will mean is that if you're an entity subject to NIS2, you'll have to make sure your systems, procedures, and processes, automated and manual, have been set up to ensure that you're capturing everything that is going to be considered an incident for the purposes of NIS2. In other words, making sure that all incidents are being picked up and are being assessed for their significance. Secondly, you'll have to make sure you've got processes in place to assess the significance of an incident for the purposes of determining whether or not it needs to be reported to a relevant competent authority. In practice, this just means being able to make a call when you look at something that's happened. Do we need to notify this to a regulator or not? There's also some thinking to be done around the calibration of what should be considered significant for any particular organization. At the moment, there's no real specific guidance under NIS2 at a European level or even at a national level as to what significance will mean in practice. There is some legacy guidance available that was issued under NIS1, which may offer some help in the meantime. But for organizations looking at this now, they will have to consider the directive level text, so that what's in front of you at the moment, and look at that and think, okay, how does this apply to our organization? When we have an incident that impacts us, what do we consider severe operational disruption? Again, you can look to historic guidance on this, which will talk about the particular hours of downtime, number of users affected, so on and so forth. But each organization will have to make a call here. Some organizations will approach this with a view to being conservative and will probably over-report for fear of not reporting something that should be reported. Whereas other organizations may look at this and think, okay, we should only be reporting the incidents that are actually significant in the true meaning of that word, and not just everything and anything that potentially meets these thresholds. And I think that's a question for each organization to ask of themselves and to do the analysis on that. One thing to bear in mind when doing this, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, is be mindful of the fact that regulators can issue RFIs, amongst other things, to organizations querying the approach that they adopt when it comes to incident notification, reporting, management, etc. And so the approach that is adopted by an organization may have to be defended, it may have to be explained, and it could be subject to regulatory scrutiny and criticism. So if an organization is being overly cautious with its reporting, that is to say it's reporting a lot of things, there is a risk that in doing so, what that does is it draws the attention of the regulator, who may think we're getting a lot of reports from this particular organization. That suggests to us either the reporting systems they have in place are wrong, or they don't have measures in place to adequately deal with cybersecurity threats to stop them becoming incidents, and that may trigger some interest. On the reverse, if you're not reporting anything, but your peers are, then that may attract regulatory scrutiny, where the regulator may think it's interesting we've not received particular notifications from this one entity. We should ask them some questions about why they're not notifying us, particularly if an incident, for example, affects a broad range of organizations all at once. Some report and some don't. So it's just one thing to bear in mind. Now, if an incident is significant and therefore reportable, NIS 2 establishes, broadly speaking, a three-stage process for incident reporting. So you have the early warning, you have incident notification, and then you have the final report. So taking each of these in turn, the early warning has to be issued without undue delay and in any event within 24 hours of becoming aware of a significant incident. So an entity that suffers an incident that it deems as significant has to notify that to the relevant regulator within 24 hours. Now, the notification is very high level. The requirements for what have to be included are, there are not that many, and that's intentional. So what you have to do is you have to tell the regulator, you know, we're having an incident, it's a significant incident. You have to notify whether it's been caused by unlawful or malicious activity, you know, your initial assessment, you know, is it one of these things? And could it have any cross-border impact? Now, the reason for this is that the relevant competent authority needs to be made aware of whether there's something happening here that it has to be alert to, and may have to work with others to manage, and may have to stand up a crisis response approach. That's partly why it needs to understand whether there's a cross-border impact, because it may need to work with its counterparts across Europe to manage the response to an incident that could be particularly problematic. Now, the requirements are deliberately straightforward for this 24-hour notification, and that is reflected in the recitals to NIS 2 and recital 102 particularly. It talks about organizations should be focusing their resources on managing the incident and not on issuing notifications to regulators. And so you have to do it within 24 hours, but the information that you have to provide is relatively limited. The second step of the reporting process is the incident notification itself. Now, this has to be issued within 72 hours of becoming aware of the significant incident, or another way, 48 hours after the 24-hour period has expired. So if you issue your early warning on the 24th hour, you then have 48 hours after which to put in your incident notification. And the incident notification is a slightly more detailed notification to the regulator. In this notification, you will be updating the early warning information that you provided if you need to. And then you should also be providing an initial assessment of the incident, its severity, its impact, and details regarding any indication of compromise. The third stage of the reporting process is issuing the final report. So within 1 month of issuing the incident notification, you're required to submit a final report to the relevant competent authority. And that final report should include a detailed description of the incident, its severity, and its impact. It should cover the type of threat or root cause that likely triggered the incident. It should talk about the applied and ongoing mitigation measures that have been implemented in response to the incident. And it should also explore the cross-border impact of the incident where that is applicable. Now, if you happen to be involved in an incident which is ongoing at the time when your final report is due, then you will have to issue a progress report. Now, NIS 2 doesn't actually cover what a progress report has to entail, but I would imagine it will be an updated version of the incident notification. Now, if you're in the situation where you've got an ongoing incident a month after you've issued the incident notification, I think it's a safe bet to assume that the regulator will be in relatively constant contact with you. And so the progress report may not be a particularly complicated matter because there should probably be a back and forth with the regulator already. Nevertheless, once the incident has been settled, you are still required to issue the final report within a month of it being settled. There's a few observations I would make about incident reporting under NIS 2, which I think are worth bearing in mind as organizations prepare for compliance. If I was coming at NIS 2 fresh for my organization and thinking about ways to comply, to de-risk, and to reduce risk exposure generally, I would probably focus efforts on the incident reporting processes to make sure these are aligned with NIS 2. I mean, okay, actually what I would do in practical terms is I would take a look at all the cybersecurity measures we have in place, firstly. and then align those with the requirements under NIS2 on Article 21, as Clara's mentioned. Work out what you have, what can be leveraged to achieve compliance, where the gaps are, and then start to work on plugging the gaps. But at the same time, I would also be looking at incident reporting and the flows that are in place, because I would expect, at least to some extent, regulators will use incidents that are happening that they're being made aware of one way or another as a trigger for doing investigations, auditing organizations that are in scope, issuing RFIs. And as an organization, the last place you want to be is on the back foot with a regulator. So if a regulator has been made aware of an incident affecting a number of players in the market, either through the media, through online discussions, through another entity that's happened to notify, or from a complainant, and you haven't notified, being on the back foot in that scenario, because, say, you don't have a proper incident reporting process in place, it is not going to be a good place to be, and it could make a bad situation worse. And so I'd be focusing my efforts on making sure that we're in a place to get those notifications out and to present as good a picture and as good a narrative as we can about what has happened. So in terms of looking at things to do now to prepare for this, I mean, I would create template notification forms. I would make sure that you've got your 24-hour, your 72-hour, and your final report forms in place, so that you know what content is going to go into each of them based on the directive. That's the minimum level of information that needs to go into each of them. So you can create those forms now and work with your business, work with the points of contact to make sure that you can get that information within those time periods. Get the processes stood up, get the relevant points of contact on board, make sure you have processes for ensuring that when the notification has to go, the right people have signed off, so on and so forth, and have all that in place. And then test it, make sure it works, change it, and be ready for when an incident happens. It's just a case of populating the documents you've already done. It's a case of running through a process you've run through, hundreds of times already, and you focus your efforts on managing the incident, and you just get the notifications out almost as a matter of course. I think having those processes in place will be hugely beneficial for organizations, because it takes one less thing to think about off people's minds when you're in the midst of a potentially a crisis. One other thing I would say about incident reporting is, if you are one of the, let's say, unfortunate entities that's going to be subject to potentially overlapping and concurrent jurisdiction of multiple member states, there is a possibility that you will be required to notify a single incident to multiple regulators in each member state. So, for example, if you're a telco, you're going to have obligations potentially to notify an incident in every single member state where your services are provided, which could be every single member state. Now, leaving aside the legal issues associated with that, just from a practical perspective, what that will require is understanding, well, what is the process in that particular jurisdiction for issuing a notification? Is it an online form? Is it anything I want to submit? Is it a paper form? Is there a portal I have to use? Being really clear on what process you have to follow in a particular jurisdiction when an incident happens is really important, just again from a practical perspective. Looking at the legal side of that same issue, because NIS2 is a directive, it is within the gift of each member state to implement national law, which goes above and beyond the requirements of NIS2. So it is quite possible that a particular jurisdiction will require the minimum information set out in NIS2 for the notifications as is set out in front of you, but it could go beyond that. It could ask for additional details, which you'll be required to provide. And again, that will require organizations to get across the detail of what each country requires and make sure that notifications are ticking the boxes in those countries. So I think if you take nothing else away from what I'm talking about today, I would focus some effort on thinking around incident reporting and how you as an organization are going to manage when something happens that requires your attention. Turning now to regulatory oversight and the implications of non-compliance. As Clara mentioned earlier, this is where the distinction between being an essential entity and an important entity comes to life, because essential entities are going to be subject to proactive regulatory supervision and oversight, whereas important entities are going to be subject to a more reactive or light touch supervisory regime. I think that's both for practical and resource considerations. Regulators only have so much bandwidth And so effort would likely be better served by focusing on those entities that are deemed essential to the operation of an economy or a society, as opposed to those that are just deemed important. So that's part of the thinking around why we ended up at this distinction, and particularly with respect to regulatory oversight. Now, that's not to say important entities will never be looked into, or will only be looked into if they suffer a big breach or something bad has gone wrong. The trigger for an important entity being subject to regulatory supervision and questioning, I suppose, is if the regulator becomes aware of any indication of non-compliance or any suggestion that something isn't quite in line with the NIS2 requirements. This could happen as a result of, again, another entity making a report which implicates the important entity. It could be something in the media. It could be a complaint from an individual. It could also be just something that's published and made available by the organization. So organizations that are maybe publishing material or filing reports, corporate reports or documentations, or even diligence documents, worth having half an eye on including something in there that would pique a regulator's interest from a cybersecurity and NIS2 perspective. So just one thing to bear in mind. Now, I'm not going to split out the supervisory powers and enforcement powers as applied to essential entities and important entities. There's a lot of overlap and similarity between the two. It's just that the list for important entities is slightly shorter. But we'll just touch on what these powers are, because there is as you can see from the list in front of you, it's a pretty wide range of powers that the regulators will have. So they can conduct on-site inspections and off-site supervision. They can do regular and targeted security audits that we carried out by an independent auditor. They can also do ad hoc audits where non-compliance has come to light or a significant incident has happened. And so you might find a regulator just deciding it's going to conduct an audit to assess the levels of compliance. There can also be security scans. More technical things can occur. And then on top of that, you have the information powers of the regulators. So they can request information which will allow them to assess the measures that have been adopted by an entity to comply with NIS2. They can also request access to data, documents, or other information that will help them perform and fulfill their supervisory functions, and request evidence of the implementation of cybersecurity policies. Again, going back to what Clara touched on, a regulator may just select, say, 5 or 6 entities that fall within its scope, the biggest entities, and ask for information on what they've done. And they may do this, let's say, innocently. They may do this just to understand what market practice is and what it looks like and get a sense of the state of play. But they may also do this just to figure out, okay, how far apart are people, and what do we consider compliant, what do we consider non-compliant, and they may take action that way. So just worth bearing in mind, the powers, supervisory powers, are pretty broad and extensive. They're not tied to the occurrence of particular events all the time, and so a regulator can just ask questions and issue RFIs. This could happen in the course of an incident. So you could be reporting an incident and the regulator still issue RFIs and request information and require that you produce material in that context. So just worth keeping that in mind. Now, the supervisory powers are coupled with pretty extensive enforcement powers. And again, these are listed out on the screen there. So I won't touch on all of these, but ones that I think are of particular interest is the fact that a regulator can require an organization to bring the risk management measures, so again, the measures Clara touched on, and the reporting obligations into compliance with NIS2. So, an organization could find itself having, under an audit being performed on it, then being met with a list of measures that they have to implement, on threat of a penalty being imposed. So that's quite interesting that you can have regulators having that degree of oversight over the cybersecurity measures that an organization has implemented. There's also the possibility that a regulator could require an entity to inform its service recipients that something has happened. Now, there are provisions within this too that talk about notifying service recipients of cyber threats and incidents, but this enforcement power allows the regulator to tell an organization that it has to do so. Which could be problematic for public entities or public listed entities. So again, something just to bear in mind there. And then the last thing I point about enforcement powers is the fact that regulatory bodies can issue fines. So the fines can be issued in addition to any of the enforcement powers. And the fines that can be issued are significant. So it can be, the way it's phrased in this too is because the directive is slightly confusing, but the minimum maximum that can be imposed on an essential entity is 10 million euro, or 2% of annual worldwide turnover, and 7 million and 1.4% for important entities. What I would say about this is what we've seen from the GDPR in practice is the number, the 10 million, the 7 million, maybe less relevant, and it's the percentage of global turnover that may be the figure that regulators look to rely on when they are imposing fines. But these are significant amounts, so non-compliance can result in significant issues for organisations. Now, the last thing I'll talk about on regulatory oversight and implications of non-compliance is a sort of adjacent point. This is to do with management bodies. So I would say the most notable aspect of NIS 2 when it comes to risks associated with non-compliance is the introduction of liability for the management bodies of in-scope entities. So this represents quite a clear step change in terms of risk level for the entities subject to NIS 2 and eliminates any remaining doubt that there might have been that cybersecurity risk management needs to be taken seriously at board level. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the entities that I deal with, it is taken seriously at board level by almost all those organisations. But for those that maybe don't take it that seriously yet, this provision in NIS 2 will be a shot in the arm to those organisations. So very specifically, management bodies within an in-scope entity have specific obligations to approve the cybersecurity risk management measures implemented, i.e. those that Clara spoke about under Article 21. They have a requirement to oversee the implementation of such measures, and then they can be held liable for infringements of the obligations to implement the measures. So if an organisation has not implemented the measures that it needs to implement under Article 21, the management body for that entity can be held liable. Now, the term management body is not defined, rather unhelpfully, in NIS 2. And so there is a degree of ambiguity around what exactly the management body of an in-scope entity will be. That said, there is other legislation within the EU that allows us to have a more of an educated guess, I suppose, about what the management body will consist of. So we can look at, for example, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which we mentioned earlier. We can look at MiFID II, and we can look at even the DSA to guide us as to what the management body is likely to be. Ultimately, though, we will be looking to the national implementing legislation to give us the specifics on this. But what we can say at this stage is, at a minimum, we would expect that the management body for the purposes of NIS 2 will be the board of directors of a company. Now, it remains to be seen whether senior management, those not at board level, but those who are, say, have the most senior operational control over cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk management, they may be on the hook. They may be found liable, but again, we'd be looking to what the national implementing laws say. What we can say from those laws that were reviewed, and again, we'll talk very quickly in a moment about the state of play in Europe, but what we can say is the direction of travel in this field seems to be civil liability for the management bodies, so fines for non-compliance. And the range of fines we've seen in the legislation so far is quite broad. I mean, some legislation refers to 500 euro fines as the minimum, and that goes all the way up to 200,000 euro for non-compliance. So the range of measures that could be imposed on a management body or the level of fines rather is relatively broad. So, and I think from a French perspective, Clara, there is some there's something we can get from the
yeah, well, it's not really specific to the management bodies, and we can talk about it a little bit later, but just to say that the ANSSI, which is the French agency, really confirmed that they do not expect enforcement before 3 years, to give time to the transposition and to have a really solid framework on regulatory standpoint. So we still have time before implementation of all of these sanctions.
Okay. Yeah, and then we can turn now just to, I mean, there's a lot to say about the management body position. I think organisations that are subject to NIS 2 should be thinking about who their management body is and making sure that the management body are aware of and alive to their obligations under NIS 2 and are being kept informed of the organisation's progress in that regard. If we look at what the status is around the EU, I won't spend a huge amount of time on this. I mean, you can see from the slide there, more or less where we're at. You know, some member states have published their drafts or their final text of the law. Many have not, or many are very early on the stages, and some are just admitting that they're not going to get anything published before the 17th of October deadline. So NIS2 specifically says that the measures that member states are going to implement have to be communicated to the Commission by the 17th of October and to take effect from the 18th of October. So the 18th of October is the day from which all NIS2 related enforcement is supposed to begin. I think what we can say is that it seems likely that in a number of EU member states there is going to be no NIS2 implementing legislation in place, or there'll be NIS2 implementing legislation in place that doesn't maybe take effect, or as Clara said, begins its enforcement for a period of time. That's an issue more for the member state than for organisations, honestly, because if you're in a country, if you're in an organisation in a country that has not implemented NIS2 legislation, then you can't comply with a law that doesn't yet exist. So you just have to comply with the law as it is in front of you. That's easier said than done for multinationals. If you are an organisation that is subject to the laws of multiple member states, and some member states have implemented NIS2 and some have not, then you're going to have to think about what your compliance approach looks like across those different member states. That could be particularly challenging in the context of incident reporting, where you might have an incident that would trigger the reporting obligations under NIS2, but doesn't trigger the reporting obligations under the original NIS directive, and maybe any other law that happens to be in place at that time. So you'll have to give consideration as to how you tactically play that. You know, do you just notify in the country which the NIS2 legislation has been implemented? Do you do a courtesy notification in the countries where NIS2 legislation hasn't been implemented but will be, and you would report if it was in place, so on and so forth? So there's definitely some thinking to be done around that, around the national implementation. So I think that brings us to the end of what we were going to discuss today. Now, I see from the chat we have some questions. So I'll just, if you bear with me 1 second, I'll bring some of these up and we can try and answer some of them. I think that we've seen a few questions on the size cap rules and the position for SMEs and when an organisation is caught and when it's not. Honestly, I think the best thing to do for that is, I think, obviously speak to your legal counsel about it, because it's not quite as straightforward as it appears at first glance. There are caveats to organisations. So even if you're an organisation that doesn't meet the small or medium size enterprise requirements at an EU level, you could still be subject to NIS2 and the NIS2 implementing legislation. There's also the fact that you're hostage to whatever national law says on this. So it's quite possible that national law doesn't, adhere to the minimum thresholds here and just applies to, say, all organisations in a particular sector. So yeah, I think that's all we would see on that for now. We've had a couple of questions about the incident reporting requirements. So in terms of what is needed at a national level versus what the directive says, and the clash between the two, and whether and what you can do if there's an inconsistency. Unfortunately, if your national implementing law says something different to the directive, but goes beyond the directive, so it should include at least what the directive says, but it could also go beyond the directive. And if it does that, then ultimately you'll be required to comply with that requirement. And as I mentioned when I was talking about incident reporting, that will be challenging for organizations to have to report incidents across multiple member states. So, you know, if you have to report an incident in, say, Italy, Spain, France, and each of them have slightly different reporting requirements and information to be included, then I'm afraid it's as difficult and as annoying as it will be. You will have to just submit the information as required in each country, because if you don't, you might expect the regulator to come asking questions. We've also had some questions around implementation dates and when things are going to kick off. I don't know, Clara, I know you mentioned the approach in France. Is it worth saying maybe a couple more sentences on what's happening in France at the moment?
So I was very hopeful a few weeks ago because we had a draft law in France covering both, the NIS2, but also REC and DORA. But due to political framework, this law has been delayed. So this creates quite some concern to meet the deadline of October, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think, like I said, I think there's a lot of organizations are unfortunately going to be in the position of trying to work out what they do with countries that have NIS2, countries that don't, and yeah, it's just a bit of a mess. Let's just have a look and see what other questions we can respond to here. So we've had a question about if you are not based in the EU, but doing business in the EU, what about the registration requirements? So interestingly, NIS2, again, and I hate to do this, but I'll caveat every answer we give here by saying national implementing law may change the picture here to some extent. So the NIS2 directive is just the base level, it's just the floor. Member states can do as they please, really. But the questions around if you're not based in the EU, I suppose what your concerns are. Well, NIS2 has limited extraterritorial effect, so it will only apply to entities not based in the EU when they're providing a particular type of service. So, for example, if you're providing, I think cloud computing is one of them, into the EU. If you're providing digital services into the EU, then you may be caught by NIS2. And if you're doing so, you're required to appoint a representative in one of the member states where you're providing that service. The idea being that if you're providing those services and they are integral in a particular economy or society, you should not escape regulatory oversight by the relevant competent authorities. There's a practical question there around what regulators will do, how they will enforce the law extraterritorially if they have to. But again, we'd be looking to see what each national law says on the extraterritorial application of the law. How it applies and who it applies to. This is complicated also slightly by corporate structures of entities, where you could have entities within Europe, who are not service providers, who are not caught by NIS2, but whose parents or affiliate companies are, but are not based in the EU. Then what happens in those circumstances, is how does enforcement work? What would that look like? So it's it can become quite complicated. And again, if you're a large organization with a lot of subsidiaries, consideration will just have to be given to, well, do we adopt one approach across all of our organizations and just apply it at group level? But then what do we do at individual member state level? Because potentially each entity within your group is going to be subject to its own legal obligations. But again, there's just some thinking to be done around the strategy that an organization would adopt to managing compliance where it has exposure across a number of jurisdictions. Now, I think we're at time. I appreciate we've had a really significant number of questions here. So I think what we typically try to do after this is follow up and provide responses where we can. We will share a copy of the slides afterwards for everyone to see, but also feel free. You have our contact details on the slide, so when they're issued, you'll see those. Feel free to reach out with emails or questions. You can contact both of us using those means. You can contact us on LinkedIn. I'm sure a lot of people have questions that remain unanswered, and I'm sure the extent that we can help or provide any sort of guidance, we'd both be more than happy to do so. So with that, I think all that remains to be said here is thank you so much for joining. Thank you for all the questions and the engagement. And hopefully we'll hear from some of you soon, and hopefully the journey to compliance is not too stressful.